An American farmer suddenly built a tall fence around his land and immediately drew dangerous attention. No one understood what he was hiding or why rumors and pressure began to close in around him. Watch till the end, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you're watching from and why you think he needed that fence. The farm had always followed a rhythm that felt older than calendars and contracts. Morning arrived without ceremony, with the same pale light spreading across the fields, the same wind moving through the tall grass along the drainage ditch at the edge of the property. The farmer rose before sunrise, as he had for years, and stepped outside while the air was still cool and sharp. He walked the familiar path between the house and the barns, checking locks, listening to the quiet mechanical hum of equipment left to cool overnight, watching the land wake slowly under the sky. Everything appeared orderly, controlled, and predictable, exactly the way he had worked to make it. He took pride in that order. His fields were not the largest in the county, but they were carefully maintained. The soil was tested regularly, fertilizers applied conservatively, machinery serviced on schedule. He had learned early that discipline was the difference between survival and collapse in farming. Crops did not forgive neglect, and banks did not forgive missed payments. He kept records with meticulous care, filed documents in labeled folders, and stored receipts long after most people would have thrown them away. His reputation reflected that precision. Inspectors who had visited in previous years had found nothing remarkable, which was exactly what he preferred. No trouble, no questions, no attention. The land itself carried subtle irregularities that he had long accepted without fully understanding. One corner of the property stayed damp even after long dry spells. Another produced weaker crops, stalks that looked healthy from a distance but never yielded what they should. There was a shallow depression near the old drainage ditch where rainwater lingered longer than anywhere else, darkening the soil and giving off a faint, unpleasant smell on hot days. He had assumed it was a natural quirk of the terrain or the residue of farming practices from decades earlier. Every piece of land had its secrets, and most of them were harmless. By mid-morning, the routine was complete. He returned to the house, washed his hands, and poured coffee into a chipped mug he had owned longer than the tractor parked outside. The radio murmured quietly from the kitchen counter, carrying local news and weather forecasts he half listened to. When he stepped onto the porch to collect the mail, he expected nothing more than utility bills and advertisements. The mailbox had never delivered surprises. The envelope stood out immediately. Thick paper, crisp edges, no handwritten address. The return address belonged to a law firm based in the city, its name printed in precise black letters that suggested money, caution, and long experience with conflict. He stood still for a moment, the envelope held loosely between his fingers, and felt an unfamiliar tension tighten in his chest. Legal correspondence did not arrive by accident. He opened the letter slowly, reading each line twice, then a third time. The language was careful, almost polite. It spoke of potential environmental irregularities, of a desire to ensure compliance with existing regulations, of the possibility of inspections in the near future. There were no accusations, no direct claims of wrongdoing, only a repeated emphasis on cooperation and transparency. The firm explained that it represented interests concerned with environmental responsibility and legal clarity. It requested access to the property at a mutually convenient time. The words were calm, but the meaning beneath them was not. The letter did not ask whether there was a problem. It assumed one might exist and placed him in the position of having to disprove it. The absence of a specific charge made the message more dangerous, not less. It left room for interpretation, and interpretation was a weapon in the hands of lawyers. He set the letter down on the kitchen table and stared at it while the radio continued to speak about traffic and temperatures. The name of the corporation was never mentioned directly, but he recognized the pattern. Large companies rarely approached individuals openly. They moved through intermediaries, through legal firms that spoke softly while preparing for conflict. The letter felt less like a warning and more like a declaration that he had already been noticed. The farmer walked through the house, gathering documents almost without conscious thought. The contract from when he purchased the land, soil reports, records of fertilizers and pesticides used over the years. He laid them out on the table, creating a paper landscape that mirrored the fields outside. Everything he had done was legal. He was certain of that. Yet certainty offered little comfort when someone else controlled the narrative. As he read the letter again, a memory surfaced that he had not thought about in years. When he bought the property, the previous owner had mentioned the drainage system almost in passing. Old infrastructure, built long before modern regulations, designed to carry excess water away from the fields. The farmer had walked the land with a surveyor at the time, noting shallow lines where pipes might run beneath the soil. But nothing about it had seemed unusual. Drainage systems were common, especially on land that had been farmed for generations. Now the memory sharpened. He recalled the way the older man had hesitated before changing the subject, the way his gaze had lingered on the damp corner of the field. At the time, the farmer had dismissed it as nostalgia or caution from someone reluctant to let go of land that had been in his family for decades. He had not asked questions. He had trusted the paperwork. He stepped outside and walked toward the edge of the property, letter still folded in his pocket. The wind carried the smell of earth and dry grass, familiar and grounding. He stood near the shallow depression, looking at the uneven growth of plants, the way the soil darkened unnaturally beneath the surface. For the first time, he wondered whether the problem was not above ground at all. The thought unsettled him. If the drainage system beneath his land had been used for something other than water, if waste had been directed here deliberately, then the farm was not just a victim of circumstance, it was a convenient endpoint, a place where responsibility could quietly settle without attracting attention. And if that were true, the letter was not about discovering the truth. It was about controlling it. He returned to the house with a sense of urgency that had nothing to do with farming schedules. He considered calling the number listed at the bottom of the letter, imagined the careful voice on the other end explaining procedures, offering reassurance that would later be withdrawn. He imagined inspectors walking his fields, taking samples, drawing conclusions before he had a chance to understand what lay beneath his feet. Once access was granted, control would be lost. Instead, he sat down and opened a notebook he usually reserved for crop yields and maintenance schedules. On a blank page, he began to write dates, observations, memories, the damp soil, the odd smell, the way crops failed in specific patterns rather than randomly. He sketched a rough map of the property, marking areas that had always felt wrong without knowing why. As he worked, the pieces began to form a shape that troubled him more than any legal threat. He understood then that the letter was not the beginning of the problem, only the moment when it became visible. Whatever had been happening beneath his land had likely been happening for years, perhaps decades, unnoticed or ignored. The corporation represented by the law firm might have been involved directly, or it might simply be trying to distance itself from past practices before someone else discovered them. Either way, the burden was shifting toward him. By late afternoon, he made a decision that felt instinctive rather than calculated. He would not respond immediately. He would not invite anyone onto his land until he understood exactly what they might find and how it could be used against him. The farm had always been open, defined by fences meant only to keep animals where they belonged. That openness now felt like a vulnerability. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the fields, the farmer looked at the boundaries of his property with new eyes. Lines that had once felt symbolic now appeared dangerously porous. If the truth lay hidden beneath the soil, then time was his only ally, and access was his greatest risk. He needed space to investigate, to document, to prepare for a confrontation he had not chosen but could no longer avoid. The letter lay folded on the table as night settled over the farm. Its words remained unchanged, but their weight had grown heavier with every passing hour. He knew that by morning, the quiet balance he had built his life around would already be gone. The land had begun to demand answers, and the world beyond the fields was moving closer. Morning arrived with the same pale light as always, but the farm no longer felt the same. The letter remained where he had left it, folded neatly on the kitchen table, yet its presence had seeped into every corner of the house and out across the land beyond the windows. As he moved through his routine, he noticed how often his eyes were drawn to the boundaries of the property, to the open stretches where nothing stood between his fields and the road except habit and assumption. What had once felt like freedom now appeared careless, The decision to build the fence did not come with drama or hesitation. It formed gradually as he walked the perimeter of his land, boots sinking slightly into soil still damp from recent rains. He measured distances with his eyes, tracing lines where posts could stand, imagining how the structure would cut across familiar paths and views. He understood what such a fence would signal to the outside world. It would look defensive, it would raise questions, but questions were coming regardless, and he preferred to face them on his own terms. He chose materials with the same careful logic he applied to every other aspect of the farm. The fence needed height, strength, and privacy. This was not a decorative boundary or a token barrier meant to discourage casual trespassers. It was meant to control access completely. He ordered heavy posts, thick panels that would block sight as well as movement, reinforced gates that could be locked and monitored. Each choice reflected a single purpose: time. Time to understand what lay beneath his land. Time to prepare for the pressure he knew would follow. The work began quickly. Trucks arrived carrying materials, their tires leaving fresh impressions on the gravel drive. He watched them closely, noting license plates, faces, the casual curiosity of drivers who asked polite questions about the project. He answered with practiced neutrality, explaining that theft had increased in rural areas, that insurance recommended stronger boundaries, that it was simply a matter of protecting property. None of these statements were lies, yet none revealed the real reason either. As the first posts were sunk into the ground, the fence began to take shape, altering the landscape in ways both subtle and profound. Paths he had walked freely for years now ended abruptly at rising barriers. Sight lines disappeared, replaced by solid surfaces that absorbed sound and shadow. The farm felt smaller, more contained, yet also more controlled. He moved within this changing space with a growing sense of purpose, even as unease followed him like a persistent echo. Neighbors noticed almost immediately. Cars slowed as they passed, drivers glancing toward the construction with open curiosity. Some waved, others did not. By the second day, conversations had begun beyond the fence line. Speculation carried quietly from one household to another. He could feel the shift in tone when he visited town for supplies. People watched him more closely, their greetings shorter, their questions carefully phrased. The fence had turned him from a familiar presence into an object of interest. He expected this reaction and accepted it as part of the cost. The farm had never relied on closeness with the community. Independence was its strength. Still, the isolation stung in ways he had not anticipated. He had lived among these people for years without conflict, shared unspoken agreements about space and respect. Now those agreements were dissolving, replaced by suspicion that he could neither control nor fully dispel. The legal pressure intensified quietly, as he had suspected it would. A second letter arrived, this one less measured in tone. It referenced the previous correspondence and emphasized the importance of cooperation. It mentioned potential regulatory involvement if access was denied. He read it without surprise, filed it with the first, and returned to the work outside. Responding too soon would only invite further intrusion. At night, he walked the length of the fence with a flashlight, checking bolts and joints, listening to the unfamiliar acoustics of the enclosed space. Sounds carried differently now. The wind struck solid surfaces and returned to him altered, the calls of distant animals muted or distorted. He noticed how shadows gathered along the base of the panels, creating pockets of darkness where none had existed before. The fence did not simply block the outside world, it reshaped his relationship to it. On the third night, he saw the car. It sat parked on the shoulder of the road just beyond the eastern boundary, engine off, lights dark. There was nothing overtly threatening about its presence. Cars passed through that stretch of road every day. Yet this one remained longer than necessary, its stillness conspicuous against the rhythm of traffic. He watched from behind the fence, unseen, until the car eventually pulled away. The message was subtle but unmistakable. He had been noticed. The fence continued to rise. Gates were installed, locks tested repeatedly until he was satisfied. He added simple measures to track movement near the entrances, not out of paranoia but practicality. If someone attempted to breach the boundary, he wanted to know when and where. The project consumed his days, leaving little time to dwell on the implications. Physical labor offered focus, a way to channel anxiety into measurable progress. Yet even as the fence neared completion, doubt crept in. He understood how the structure might be interpreted by inspectors or lawyers. It could be framed as an attempt to conceal wrongdoing, as evidence of awareness or guilt. The thought lingered as he tightened the final bolts, his hands moving automatically, while his mind raced through possible futures. There was no perfect move left to make. Every choice carried risk. When the last section was secured, the farm stood enclosed in a way it never had before. The fence formed an unbroken line, tall and unyielding, punctuated only by locked gates. From inside, the world beyond felt distant, filtered, controlled. From outside, the farm had become opaque, its inner workings hidden from view. The transformation was complete. The effect on daily life was immediate. Deliveries required coordination. Visitors were screened or turned away entirely. The sense of openness that had once defined the property was replaced by deliberate boundaries. He adapted quickly, adjusting routines, memorizing the new geography of his own land. Control brought a measure of calm, even as it heightened his awareness of the stakes. The neighbors' reactions hardened over time. What began as curiosity edged toward resentment. The fence disrupted informal paths people had used for years, shortcuts taken without thought. Now those paths ended at locked gates. He received no direct complaints, but he felt the shift in atmosphere, the quiet withdrawal of goodwill. He reminded himself that popularity had never been the goal. The first signs of interference appeared a week after the fence was completed. He noticed a section near the western gate where the ground had been disturbed. Footprints pressed into soft earth. The fence itself was intact, untouched. But someone had approached it closely, testing distance and visibility. He examined the area carefully, documenting what he saw before smoothing the soil back into place. The encounter left him unsettled not because of damage, but because of intent. Someone was assessing the boundary, learning its weaknesses. He responded by reinforcing the area, adding measures that would make future approaches more visible. Each adjustment tightened his control but also deepened the sense that he was preparing for confrontation. The fence had become more than a physical structure. It was a declaration, whether he intended it or not, a line drawn between what he would allow and what he would not. As days passed, the fence began to feel less like a shield and more like a temporary refuge. He understood that it could not stop legal action, nor could it prevent scrutiny indefinitely. What it could do was slow the process, disrupt assumptions, and give him the space to act deliberately. That space was precious. One evening, standing near the central gate as the sun dropped below the horizon, he looked back across the enclosed fields. The land appeared unchanged within the boundary, yet he knew that something fundamental had shifted. The fence marked the moment when he stopped being a passive owner of the land and became its active defender. Whatever lay beneath the soil, whatever history had been buried there, would not be uncovered on someone else's schedule. The decision he had made in response to the letter had already reshaped his world. The farm was no longer simply a place of work and quiet routine. It was a contested space, defined by questions that reached far beyond its borders. As darkness settled and the first stars appeared above the fence line, he felt the weight of what was to come pressing closer, contained for now, but waiting. The fence changed the way the farm breathed. Within its boundaries, the land felt quieter, as if it had been asked to keep its secrets a little longer. The farmer moved through his days with a heightened awareness, every sound and shift of light registering more sharply than before. The sense of being watched lingered, but it no longer paralyzed him. Instead, it sharpened his focus. He had bought himself time, and he intended to use it. He began by preparing carefully, resisting the urge to dig immediately. Impulse, he knew, would lead to mistakes, and mistakes would cost him everything. He spread old maps across the kitchen table, comparing them to more recent surveys, tracing faint lines where drainage channels might run beneath the soil. He marked areas that had always troubled him: the low-lying corner where water lingered too long, the strip of land where crops never thrived, the shallow depression near the ditch that seemed to draw runoff no matter how dry the season. Each mark felt like a quiet accusation against the ground itself. Tools were gathered methodically: shovels, a manual auger, protective gloves, sealable containers for soil and water samples, labels, markers, a camera with extra batteries. He treated the process like an inspection conducted by someone who understood both the land and the law. Every movement would be documented, every discovery recorded with dates and locations. If this ever left the farm, it would leave as evidence, not suspicion. He started where the soil was weakest, choosing a spot near the old drainage ditch where the earth had always seemed darker, heavier. The first layer came away easily, damp and cool despite days without rain. As he dug deeper, the smell changed. It was not the rich organic scent of healthy soil, but something sharper, metallic, faintly chemical. He paused often, steadying his breath, reminding himself that panic would not help him understand what he was uncovering. At a depth that made no sense for ordinary agricultural drainage, his shovel struck something solid. The sound was unmistakable, dull and hollow in a way stone never was. He cleared the surrounding soil carefully, revealing the curved surface of a pipe. It was thicker than anything used for field drainage, its material unfamiliar under his hands. When he brushed away the remaining dirt, he saw markings along its side, faded but deliberate, the kind of industrial labeling meant to survive decades underground. The realization settled slowly, heavy and undeniable. This was not a farmer's solution to excess water. This was infrastructure, purpose-built, concealed, and never intended to be noticed. He extended the excavation, following the line of the pipe as far as he could without heavy machinery. It ran straight, unwavering, its direction aligned not with the natural slope of the land, but with something planned, engineered. When he reached a joint sealed with bolts and a corroded valve, the implications grew darker. Valves existed to control flow, to open and close, to manage something that was meant to move through the system deliberately. He collected soil samples from different depths, sealing them carefully, labeling each with precise notes. He photographed everything: the pipe, the valve, the surrounding earth. The camera captured details his eyes might miss, details that could not be dismissed later as imagination or exaggeration. As he worked, he felt the weight of the fence pressing in around him, not as confinement, but as protection. Without it, this discovery would already be someone else's problem to define. Over the next days, he expanded his search. He moved cautiously, choosing locations based on logic rather than instinct, cross-referencing old records with what he could observe on the surface. Each new excavation confirmed the first. Pipes branched and rejoined, forming a network that extended beyond the limits of his property. Some sections were older, their surfaces rough with corrosion, while others bore signs of more recent maintenance: fresh clamps, newer materials, repairs that suggested continued use long after regulations should have rendered such systems obsolete. The soil told its own story. In some areas, it was lifeless, compacted in unnatural ways, resistant to growth despite years of careful farming. Water collected in shallow pools carried a thin, iridescent sheen that caught the light in unsettling patterns. He took samples of that water too, noting its texture, its faint chemical taste when touched cautiously to the tip of a finger, and immediately wiped away. It was nothing he could name, but it was unmistakably wrong. As the pattern emerged, so did its direction. The pipes did not originate on his land. They entered it. Their orientation pointed toward the industrial edge of the county, where aging facilities sat alongside newer operations, places that employed hundreds and generated revenue. Local officials were reluctant to question. The farm, positioned lower and farther from scrutiny, had served as a convenient endpoint. Whatever flowed through the system ended here, absorbed by soil that no one thought to examine too closely. The implication hollowed him out. He had not simply inherited a problem. He had inherited responsibility without consent, made vulnerable by ignorance and distance from power. The letter from the law firm now made perfect sense. If scrutiny came, it would stop at his fence unless he forced it to travel further upstream. Signs of interference appeared sooner than he expected. One afternoon, returning to a marked site, he found the ground disturbed, his carefully placed flags pulled from the soil and tossed aside. Footprints circled the area, cautious and deliberate. Someone had not stumbled onto his work by accident. Someone was checking what he had found. He documented the intrusion, photographing the prints before smoothing the earth back into place. The fence had kept them out, but it had not kept them unaware. The knowledge that he was no longer alone in his investigation settled uneasily. He adjusted his routine, varying the times he worked, storing samples in different locations, creating redundancies in his records. If something disappeared, he wanted to know exactly when and how. Sleep became elusive. His mind replayed the implications of every discovery, every bolt and valve hidden beneath fields he had trusted. Yet beneath the exhaustion, resolve hardened. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that ignorance would not protect him. Silence would not save him. The system beneath his land had been designed to operate unseen, relying on distance and indifference. He had removed both. By the end of the week, the scale of what he faced was undeniable. This was not a single violation or a relic of outdated practices. It was a network, sustained and maintained, with intent that reached beyond his property and into the structures that governed the region. The fence that encircled his farm now felt less like an act of defiance and more like the first line of containment. Standing over one of the open excavations at dusk, he looked along the invisible path of the pipes as they disappeared beneath the earth. He understood then that the farm had become a junction point, a place where buried decisions surfaced. Whatever came next would not be subtle. The system he had begun to expose would not allow itself to be dismantled quietly. As he covered the site carefully, restoring the surface to appear undisturbed, he felt the weight of attention pressing closer. The fence had bought him time, but time was already running short. What he held in his hands now was no longer suspicion, it was proof. The proof he had uncovered did not sit quietly beneath the soil. It seemed to radiate outward, changing the atmosphere of the farm even when no one else could see what lay hidden underground. The fence still stood firm, the land inside it unchanged to the untrained eye. Yet the sense of containment he had relied on began to erode. Discovery had shifted him from preparation into exposure, and exposure invited pressure. It began formally, as he had expected. Vehicles arrived one morning bearing official insignia, their presence announced not by force, but by paperwork. Inspectors stepped out with measured confidence, carrying clipboards and neutral expressions. They requested access politely, referencing regulations and procedures, speaking in language designed to sound routine. He listened carefully, noting how their attention drifted repeatedly toward the same sections of land he had marked in his notebook. They did not yet know what he knew, but they suspected enough to focus their gaze. He allowed only what the law required, controlling movement through the gates, observing their methods closely. They took surface samples, made notes, exchanged glances that suggested conclusions forming quietly between them. Nothing overtly hostile occurred, yet every gesture felt calibrated, as if they were testing how far they could go without resistance. When they left, they did so with assurances that results would be reviewed and that further contact was likely. The farm fell silent again, but the silence carried weight. In town, the shift was more visible. Conversation stopped when he entered stores. People who had known him for years offered strained smiles or avoided his eyes altogether. Rumors moved faster than facts, reshaping his reputation in fragments. Some said he had been dumping waste himself. Others claimed he was trying to extort money by fabricating accusations. The truth mattered less than the comfort of a story that placed blame neatly and kept larger structures untouched. He felt the social pressure as keenly as the legal kind. Farming had always required a degree of isolation, but this was different. This was exclusion, a quiet agreement to distance themselves from a problem before it could spread. He understood the impulse even as it hardened his resolve. Fear was easier to manage when it belonged to someone else. The nights grew more restless. He walked the fence line with increasing frequency, flashlight cutting through darkness, ears attuned to every unfamiliar sound. One evening, he found a section near the western boundary, scuffed and marked, the ground disturbed in a way that suggested careful probing rather than random trespass. The fence itself remained intact, but someone had tested it, learning how it responded to pressure. He documented the marks, photographing them before repairing the ground. The act of recording became both shield and burden. Each image, each note added weight to what he carried alone. The realization settled that this pressure was not accidental. It was designed to unsettle, to make him question his judgment, to push him toward a mistake that could be exploited. Sleep came in fragments. When he did rest, his mind replayed scenarios he could not control. Inspections escalating into seizures of property, lawsuits draining resources faster than crops ever could, accidents that might be dismissed as misfortune. He began to notice his own fatigue as another vulnerability. Pressure worked best when it eroded the edges of attention. Amid this strain came an attempt at resolution disguised as assistance. A representative contacted him through legal channels, offering to discuss options that might simplify matters. The language was smooth, emphasizing cooperation and mutual benefit. The proposal hinted at agreements that would limit scrutiny in exchange for concessions. It spoke of settling questions quietly, of protecting the community from disruption. He read the offer carefully, line by line, recognizing the trap beneath its courtesy. Any agreement would frame him as responsible, whether explicitly or by implication. It would close the path to broader accountability while securing his silence. The temptation lay not in the offer itself, but in the relief it promised. An end to uncertainty, a return to something resembling normalcy. He refused to respond immediately. Instead, he returned to his records, reviewing the evidence he had gathered. The pipes, the valves, the signs of recent maintenance, the intrusion at the excavation sites. Each element reinforced the same conclusion. This was not a past mistake seeking closure. It was an ongoing system seeking cover. The pressure intensified subtly after that. Paperwork arrived demanding clarifications and additional documentation. Deadlines tightened. His bank requested updated assessments, citing concerns raised by external reviews. Insurance representatives asked questions that felt rehearsed. Each interaction alone might have seemed routine. Together they formed a net, tightening incrementally. He adapted as he always had, responding with precision, providing what was required and nothing more. Still, the cumulative effect wore on him. The fence that had once represented control now felt like a boundary he had to defend constantly, not only from physical intrusion, but from narratives forming beyond it. One night he discovered a lock tampered with, its mechanism scratched and bent. Not enough to open it, but enough to demonstrate capability. The message was clear. Access could be forced if subtlety failed. He replaced the lock and reinforced the gate, documenting everything. The act steadied him, even as it underscored the escalation. In the quiet that followed, he confronted the truth he had been circling since the first discovery. This pressure would not ease on its own. It would not dissipate with time or compliance. The system beneath his land depended on silence, and silence was no longer possible. Every step he took toward understanding had pulled him deeper into conflict. Standing inside the fence as dawn approached, he watched the sky lighten over fields that now carried a different meaning. The land was no longer just his livelihood. It was evidence, contested and dangerous. The pressure pressing against him was not simply an attempt to intimidate. It was a test, measuring how much he could endure before retreating. He knew then that endurance alone would not be enough. Sooner or later, he would have to choose between containment and exposure, between absorbing the pressure and redirecting it outward. The fence had bought him time. The discoveries had given him leverage. What he did next would determine whether the pressure crushed him or forced the truth into the open. The pressure did not break suddenly. It settled into the farmer's days like a second climate, persistent and inescapable, shaping every decision he made. After the inspectors left and the offers of quiet resolution were declined, the farm entered a state of strained waiting. Nothing dramatic happened at first. No raids, no headlines, no open threats. Instead, the system tightened slowly, testing endurance rather than provoking resistance. He responded by turning inward, focusing on what he could still control. The kitchen table became a command center of sorts, covered with folders, notebooks, printed photographs, and hand-drawn maps. He spread everything out and began to organize it not as a farmer, but as someone preparing to explain a truth to people who would not want to hear it. Dates were aligned, locations were cross-referenced, patterns were clarified. The scattered discoveries of the past weeks were transformed into a coherent narrative that showed intent rather than coincidence. He cataloged the physical evidence first. Soil samples were labeled with exact coordinates and depths, sealed and stored separately. Water samples were logged with time and weather conditions. Photographs of pipes and valves were annotated, their positions marked on a map of the property. He noted the differences between older sections of the system and newer repairs, the contrast between corrosion and fresh metal that proved continued use. Each detail mattered. Each detail narrowed the space in which denials could survive. As the structure of the evidence took shape, so did its implications. He saw clearly now how far the consequences could reach. The pipes connected his land to facilities that employed much of the region. Any serious investigation would threaten livelihoods, unsettle local politics, and expose years of convenient oversight. He understood why the pressure had been so carefully calibrated. The goal was not merely to silence him, but to prevent a disruption that would ripple outward. That understanding deepened his isolation. He was no longer facing an abstract corporation or distant regulators. He was standing at the center of a network of interests that included neighbors, officials, and businesses intertwined in ways few wanted to acknowledge. Speaking out would not simply accuse faceless entities. It would implicate people who lived nearby, people who might believe they were being protected by the very silence he was being asked to maintain. The weight of that realization pressed heavily. He considered what retreat would look like, accepting a settlement, allowing inspections under controlled terms, letting responsibility be framed as accidental contamination rather than systemic abuse. The farm might survive that way, albeit diminished and marked. Life could continue, altered but intact. The thought was tempting in its simplicity, yet every time he entertained it, the images returned. The lifeless soil, the unnatural sheen on standing water, the fresh clamps on old pipes. Retreat would not erase what lay beneath the land. It would merely ensure that it continued unseen. He had not sought this role, but it had been assigned to him the moment he uncovered the truth. Walking away would not free him. It would leave him exposed, blamed, and complicit. He also understood the personal cost of escalation. Legal battles could drain resources faster than any failed harvest. Public scrutiny could isolate him completely. There was no guarantee of victory, only certainty of disruption. The system he was challenging had endured precisely because it absorbed such challenges and outlasted those who raised them. To move forward, he needed more than evidence. He needed a way to ensure that the truth, once released, could not be buried again. That realization shifted his focus from defense to strategy. He began to consider where the information could go that would make suppression difficult. Independent experts, journalists, regulatory bodies beyond local influence. Each option carried risks, but also possibilities. He prepared multiple versions of the same material, anticipating loss or interference. Copies were stored digitally and physically, separated by distance and method. He wrote a concise summary of the situation, stripping away emotion and speculation, presenting only facts and documented observations. The act of writing clarified his own resolve. Seeing the story laid out plainly made it harder to rationalize silence. As he worked, the pressure continued its steady advance. Notices arrived with tighter deadlines. Financial institutions requested additional assurances. Insurance assessments were delayed without explanation. Each obstacle reinforced the sense that he was being pushed toward a corner where surrender would seem reasonable. He recognized the tactic now and refused to mistake it for inevitability. The choice he faced crystallized over the course of a long night. Sitting alone at the table, surrounded by evidence and silence, he acknowledged that there was no path that preserved the life he had known. The question was not whether change would come, but whether it would be shaped by truth or by convenience. He could no longer pretend that inaction was a neutral stance. By dawn, the decision was made. He selected a channel that offered distance from local pressures, a route that would move the evidence beyond the reach of quiet agreements. The preparation was meticulous. Files were encrypted, duplicates verified, timelines confirmed. He sent only a portion of the material at first, enough to demonstrate credibility without revealing everything at once. It was a calculated step, designed to test response and establish interest. When the transmission was complete, a strange calm settled over him. Nothing around him changed immediately. The farm remained enclosed, the fence unbroken, the field still and waiting. Yet he knew that something irreversible had occurred. The information was no longer solely his burden. It existed elsewhere now, carried by systems he could not fully control. With that release came a new understanding of risk. He expected retaliation, subtle or otherwise. He adjusted his routines accordingly, reinforcing measures he had already put in place. But beneath the vigilance lay a steady resolve. He had crossed the line that the pressure had been designed to protect. There would be consequences, but there would also be momentum. Standing at the edge of one of the excavated sites, watching the first light touch the land, he felt the weight of responsibility settle into something more bearable. The choice he had made did not guarantee justice or vindication. It guaranteed only that the truth would have a chance to surface. For the first time since the letter arrived, that felt like enough to stand on. The fence still surrounded him, solid and uncompromising, but its meaning had shifted. It was no longer just a barrier holding the world at bay. It marked the boundary behind which a decision had been made, a point of no return. Whatever came next would unfold beyond it, driven by forces already set in motion. The calm that followed his decision did not last. It thinned gradually, worn down by the same persistent forces that had pressed against him before, now less cautious and more direct. The moment the evidence left his control and entered the hands of others, the balance shifted. The system he had disrupted responded not with outrage, but with efficiency. Official activity around the farm increased. Vehicles returned more frequently, carrying representatives whose authority was framed in regulations and compliance rather than courtesy. Notices arrived outlining additional requirements, expanded inspections, and revised interpretations of existing rules. Each document was precise, technical, and overwhelming in its accumulation. Individually, none were unreasonable. Together, they formed a pressure that threatened to consume his time, resources, and attention. He met each demand carefully, responding within the limits of the law while refusing to concede more than was required. The fence became central to this effort. Gates were opened only when procedures were followed exactly. Movements within the property monitored and recorded. The boundary he had built now functioned as a stage on which every interaction was controlled and observed. Inside it, he maintained order. Outside it, narratives continued to form without him. Attempts to force resolution intensified. Legal communications grew less ambiguous, hinting at prolonged litigation, at the financial burden of resistance. The language shifted subtly from cooperation to consequence. He recognized the strategy immediately. Exhaustion, not argument, was the goal. If they could not disprove his findings, they would make them too costly to defend. At the same time, quieter offers appeared. Proposals framed as solutions, presented through intermediaries rather than official channels. They spoke of buying the land, of compensation generous enough to erase debts and provide a clean exit. The conditions attached were implied rather than stated. Silence, non-disclosure, an end to inconvenient curiosity. The offers were tempting precisely because they acknowledged his leverage. He declined them all. Life within the fence adapted to this state of confrontation. He altered routines to minimize predictability, stored critical materials in multiple locations, and prepared for the possibility that access to the property might be challenged. The farm had become a defensive space, organized around preservation rather than productivity. Fields were still tended, animals still fed, but everything existed under the shadow of contingency. It was during this period that he made the discovery that solidified everything. Working in an area he had previously avoided to prevent detection, he uncovered a junction deeper than the others, a convergence point where multiple lines fed into a single reinforced conduit. The construction was unmistakably deliberate. Heavy-duty materials, recent welding, components that bore serial markings traceable to specific manufacturers. This was not legacy infrastructure overlooked by time. This was a maintained system. The implications were profound. Any claim that the contamination was accidental or historical collapsed under the weight of that evidence. The junction demonstrated intent and continuity, linking past practices to present action. He documented it thoroughly, aware that this was the kind of proof that could not be dismissed as misinterpretation or coincidence. Shortly after, the pressure escalated in ways that crossed from administrative into personal. Equipment malfunctioned without clear cause. A section of fencing was damaged overnight, not breached but weakened. A storage shed showed signs of tampering, tools displaced just enough to signal intrusion. Nothing catastrophic occurred, but the message was clear. Boundaries could be tested, and escalation remained an option. He responded by accelerating his plans. The full set of evidence was prepared for release, not only to the initial recipients, but to additional parties capable of independent verification. The package included not just physical proof, but context, timelines, and analysis that connected the system beneath his land to broader patterns of neglect and complicity. He ensured that no single failure could erase what he had uncovered. The moment the final transmission was sent, he understood that his role had changed again. He was no longer merely defending himself. He had become a point of origin, a reference that others would trace back to when questions were asked and accountability demanded. The fence, once a protective measure, now marked the line behind which the truth had been assembled. The response was swift. Communication ceased abruptly from some channels, replaced by silence that felt calculated rather than uncertain. From others came intensified scrutiny, attempts to undermine credibility, to frame him as unstable or motivated by grievance. None addressed the evidence directly. That omission spoke louder than any accusation. As tension peaked, a final incident drove home the cost of the path he had chosen. A fire broke out near one of the outbuildings, contained before it could spread but unmistakably deliberate in origin. The damage was limited, the warning unmistakable. He documented the scene, contacted authorities as required, and added the incident to his growing record. Fear flickered, but it did not take hold. By then, fear had lost its power to redirect him. In the days that followed, activity around the farm intensified, and then, unexpectedly, slowed. New faces appeared, distinct from the earlier inspectors, their presence marked by a different authority and a different approach. They asked broader questions, examined connections beyond the property line, and requested access to data that extended into corporate and municipal records. The investigation had crossed a threshold. Standing near the central gate one evening, he watched as the light faded beyond the fence. The land inside remained still, unchanged in its physical form, yet transformed in meaning. The line he had drawn had held. It had forced the conflict outward, away from quiet containment and into open scrutiny. He understood that whatever came next would no longer be shaped solely by his actions. The process he had triggered would move through institutions and interests far larger than himself. The fence would not protect him from all consequences, nor would it need to. Its purpose had been fulfilled. As darkness settled, he felt a measured exhaustion, tempered by clarity. The system he had challenged had not been dismantled, but it had been exposed. That exposure, fragile and incomplete as it was, represented a shift that could not easily be reversed. The line had been crossed, and there was no returning to what had existed before. The aftermath did not arrive as a single moment of reckoning. It unfolded gradually, unevenly, as systems adjusted to the disruption they could no longer contain. In the days following the final release of evidence, the farm existed in a strange suspension between isolation and attention. Activity around the property continued, but its nature changed. The familiar pattern of pressure and intimidation receded, replaced by a more structured presence that carried the weight of formal authority rather than quiet coercion. New investigators arrived whose questions extended beyond the fence and into the broader landscape. Their focus was no longer limited to the condition of the farmer's land. They traced routes outward, following documentation and technical markers that led away from the fields and toward facilities, permits, and administrative decisions made years earlier. Their approach lacked the thinly veiled hostility he had grown accustomed to. Instead, it carried a detached seriousness that suggested the matter had moved beyond containment and into accountability. News of the investigation spread quickly through the region. What had once been whispered speculation now became public knowledge, reframed by reports that spoke of systemic failures rather than individual misconduct. The narrative that had cast him as a suspicious landowner began to fracture under the weight of corroborated findings. Independent experts confirmed irregularities in soil and water samples. Technical analyses matched the infrastructure beneath his land to industrial sources upstream. The problem could no longer be localized or dismissed. The community responded in conflicting ways. Some neighbors expressed relief, their unease giving way to cautious acknowledgement that something had been wrong for a long time. Others reacted with anger, seeing the investigation as a threat to stability and employment. Tension surfaced in public meetings and private conversations, dividing the region along lines of fear and responsibility. The farmer observed these reactions from a distance, aware that his role had shifted from participant to reference point. The conflict now belonged to the community as a whole. The corporations implicated by the findings moved swiftly to protect themselves. Public statements emphasized commitment to environmental standards and cooperation with authorities. Legal teams worked to limit exposure, contest interpretations, and redirect blame toward historical practices or third-party contractors. Yet the evidence resisted simplification. Documentation of recent maintenance, serial numbers, and ongoing use undermined claims of ignorance or legacy responsibility. The story refused to be reduced to a single failure or forgotten era. As the scope of the investigation widened, consequences followed. Facilities were inspected, operations paused, permits reviewed. Regulatory agencies previously silent were forced into action under national scrutiny. The process was slow and contested, marked by procedural delays and legal challenges, but it moved forward nonetheless. Each step confirmed that what had been hidden beneath one farm extended far beyond it. For the farmer, the changes were deeply personal. His days were no longer defined by routine alone. Meetings, requests for clarification, and the presence of observers became part of his life. He provided information when asked, always carefully, always within the bounds of fact. He avoided speculation, letting the documentation speak for itself. Trust, once eroded, began to rebuild in unexpected ways as the truth asserted its own authority. There were losses. Financial strain mounted as legal processes consumed time and resources. Relationships with some neighbors remained strained, marked by resentment that no investigation could immediately resolve. The sense of quiet anonymity he had once valued was gone, replaced by recognition that carried both respect and burden. He understood that this visibility would not fade quickly, if at all. Yet there were also moments of affirmation. Independent assessments validated his findings. Environmental specialists confirmed that the contamination had posed risks not only to land, but to water sources relied upon by surrounding communities. The narrative shifted decisively away from individual blame and toward systemic neglect. That shift, more than any official statement, marked the true turning point. The fence still stood around the farm, unchanged in its physical presence, but transformed in meaning. It no longer served to keep the world out. It marked the boundary where concealment had ended and scrutiny begun. Visitors passed through its gates with purpose now, their presence regulated by transparency rather than resistance. The structure that had once symbolized isolation became a reminder of the moment when silence had been refused. The land itself began to change as remediation efforts were planned and initiated. Sections of soil were treated, monitored, and, where necessary, removed. The work was careful and deliberate, guided by data gathered not only from the investigation, but from the farmer's own early records. Watching this process unfold, he felt a complicated mixture of vindication and grief. The damage had been real, the recovery uncertain, but the acknowledgement of harm carried its own weight. As months passed, the intensity of attention lessened, replaced by the slower rhythm of institutional follow-through. Reports were filed, recommendations issued, cases prepared. Some outcomes remained unresolved, tied up in courts and negotiations that would stretch on for years. The farmer accepted this with a patience born of experience. Farming had taught him that not all work yielded immediate results, and that some seasons required endurance rather than harvest. In quieter moments, he reflected on the path that had led him here. The letter that had arrived without warning, the decision to build the fence, the first excavation that revealed more than soil. Each step had felt incremental at the time, guided by necessity rather than ambition. Only in retrospect did the shape of the journey become clear. He had not set out to challenge a system, he had set out to protect his land. The rest had followed inevitably. The farm would never return to what it had been. Neither would he. The experience had stripped away assumptions about safety and neutrality, replacing them with a more demanding understanding of responsibility. Ownership, he now knew, extended beyond boundaries and titles. It included stewardship of what lay unseen and the courage to confront what others preferred to ignore. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the fields, he walked the fence line once more. The air carried the familiar scent of earth, altered now by the work underway, but still alive with possibility. He paused at the gate, resting his hand against the solid structure he had built in response to fear and uncertainty. It had served its purpose, not by hiding the truth, but by giving him the space to uncover it. Beyond the fence, the world continued to change, shaped by forces larger than any one person. Inside it, the land endured, scarred but acknowledged, its story finally visible. He stood there for a long moment, neither triumphant nor defeated, but grounded in the knowledge that silence had a cost and that he had chosen, at last, not to pay it. The fence remained, not as a barrier, but as a marker of where responsibility had been claimed and where a single decision had forced a system to look at itself. In that knowledge, he found a measure of peace, hard-earned and incomplete, but real enough to stand on as the farm moved forward into whatever came next. If this story made you think, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos and the stories coming after this one. Watch our other videos for more true-to-life stories like this. And if you found it powerful, share it with someone who needs to see it.